chains made from the entrails of his own son. Not iron, not rope. Flesh turned to unbreakable bonds by the gods themselves. This is Loki, blood brother to Odin, king of Asgard. The god who once sat beside the throne of the Aesir, drank from their cups, and returned home to gales of laughter he had caused. Now a serpent hangs above his skull, and every drop of venom that lands sends a scream through the mountain roots, a tremor the humans above will one day call an earthquake. Somewhere no god visits anymore. The gods who bound him once called him family. So how does a brother end up chained beneath a mountain by the very hands that swore blood with his? That woman kneeling beside him is his wife. She has not left. Everyone else has. To understand why Loki is here, we have to go back to the oath that made him family in the first place, and to everything that oath was never quite strong enough to protect. Loki was never born into this hall. He was Jotun by blood, son of giants, born on the other side of a war Asgard had spent generations winning. In a hall built on bloodlines and old victories, he had no birthright to any of it. And yet Odin, king of Asgard, one-eyed and half-mad with wisdom bought at terrible cost, chose him anyway. They cut their palms and mixed blood. Not as ritual, not as formality, but as a vow that was supposed to outrank birth. Wherever Odin drank, Loki would drink beside him. That was the promise a king made to a giant's son. But a vow spoken in blood is not the same as a place earned in the room. Loki became useful the way a person becomes useful when they know their welcome has a limit. He talked giants out of Asgard's treasures. He talked a dwarf into forging Thor's hammer. Every time Asgard stood at the edge of catastrophe, it was Loki's tongue that walked them back from it. But every rescue had his fingerprints on the disaster that made it necessary in the first place. Once, for no reason but mischief, he cut off the golden hair of Sif, Thor's wife, while she slept. Thor's rage nearly ended him on the spot. To survive it, Loki bargained with the dwarfs for hair spun from real gold, and left the forge with a hammer for Thor and gifts for every god in the hall. The Aesir cheered him that night. But the dwarf he cheated in the bargain sewed his lips shut for the insult, and no god in that hall stopped it from happening. They loved what he gave them. They rarely defended him from what it cost him. It happened again with Idun, keeper of the apples that kept every god young. Loki tricked her outside Asgard's walls, and a giant carried her off before anyone could stop it. Within days the gods were aging, gray hair, stooped shoulders, gods who had never known frailty suddenly afraid of it. They did not ask him to fix it. They told him to fix it, or die for it. Loki got her back, borrowed a set of falcon wings, flew into the giant's own hall, and stole her out from under him. Asgard celebrated that night. Nobody apologized for the threat. There was one god the Aesir loved without complication, Baldr, bright and beloved, Odin's own son. His mother Frigg had gone to every living thing and every substance that could cause harm, fire, water, iron, stone, disease, every beast and every metal, and taken an oath from each one that it would never touch him. Baldr could not be harmed. Not by anything. It became a game. In the great hall, gods threw axes and spears at him for entertainment, and every blade turned aside before it reached his skin. He never bled, not once. Except one god in that hall was not laughing along with the rest. He wanted to know what Frigg had missed. Loki changed his shape, an old woman now, harmless, curious, and found Frigg apart from the hall. He asked her plainly, had she truly sworn every living thing to spare her son? Frigg answered honestly, the way you answer a stranger you have no reason to suspect. There was one thing she had not asked. It seemed too small to matter. It grew west of Valhalla, thin and young, and she had judged it too harmless to bother swearing. Mistletoe. Loki cut it himself, shaped it into a dart, and carried it back to the hall where the gods were still laughing, still hurling blades at a god who could not be hurt. One brother stood outside the game entirely. HR, blind since birth, could not see well enough to aim, and had never once been handed a weapon to throw. Loki sat beside him, told him he shouldn't be left out of the one game where his brother finally couldn't be hurt, offered to guide his hand, pointed his arm toward Baldr, and helped him throw. Baldr fell, and this time he did not stand back up. Loki could have stopped HR's hand at any point before the dart left it. He did not. Grief tore through Asgard the way it tears through any family that believed itself untouchable. And grief, in a hall built on old debts and older suspicions, does not stay grief for long. It becomes a question: who benefits from this? Everyone in that hall already knew who liked riddles too much, who solved problems no one else saw coming, because he was usually the one who had set them in motion to begin with. There was still one door left open. Hel, ruler of the dead, offered a bargain. If every single thing in every world would weep for Baldr, she would release him back to the living. And this is where the oldest surviving version of the story gets strange. Nearly everything wept, stone and beast and god alike. But one giantess, alone in a cave, refused. "Let Hel keep what she has," she said. "Try eyes for a dead man's return." The gods suspected exactly who that giantess really was. What began as one death in one family had become a verdict against an entire kingdom's trust. Baldr could return only through universal grief, and universal grief had just been denied by someone who had walked into that hall wearing a familiar face for years. Loki did not disappear quietly. Word reached him that Aegir, a lord of the sea, was holding a feast for the gods, and Loki went uninvited. He forced his way past the doorkeeper and walked into a hall full of gods who had just buried Baldr because of him, and started talking. He went around the table one god at a time, and said out loud everything the feast was pretending not to know. Old exiles. Old affairs. Every private shame anyone in that room had spent years burying under pleasant conversation. When they tried to throw him out, Loki reminded Odin of one thing before anyone could stop him: the blood they had mixed together. Long before any of this, when Odin swore that wherever he drank, Loki would drink beside him. Nobody in that hall could deny the oath. Nobody offered him a seat either. It was Thor's hammer, not an answer, that finally silenced him. Loki left the feast on his own 2 feet, but everyone in that hall understood exactly what came next. He built a house on a mountainside with a door facing every direction, so he could watch for the Aesir approaching from any side. And out of boredom, or habit, he tied together a net for catching fish, the very first one anyone had ever made. He saw them coming before they saw him, and burned the net in the fire. But the shape of it stayed pressed into the ash. When the gods reached the empty house, they found the pattern in the coals and rebuilt the net exactly as he tied it. His own invention became the trap that caught him. Loki turned himself into a salmon and hid in the river below the waterfall. But Odin has one eye, and it sees further than most gods too. They dragged the net through the current until they cornered him, and caught him mid-leap by the tail, which is why, the old story says, salmon have narrow tails to this day. They did not kill him. Asgard had a longer memory than that, and a crueler one. What they built for him instead was not an execution. It was a sentence with no end date. The gods took 2 of Loki's own sons into that cave, Vali and Narfi. One was turned into a wolf before his father's eyes. The wolf tore the other apart. The gods took the entrails of that death and turned them to iron, binding to hold what blood alone could no longer restrain. This is the moment the opening of this story showed you. The serpent above his head was placed there by Skadi, a giantess whose own father Loki had helped kill, years earlier, in another one of his schemes. Every old debt in Asgard, it turns out, had been waiting its turn to collect. Every rescue Loki had ever performed for these gods, every joke, every blood oath sworn beside Odin's throne, none of it bought him a single hour of mercy in that cave. Only one figure stayed. His wife, Sigyn, who had not caused any of it, and who chose the cave anyway. This was never really a story about a monster the gods finally caught. It is a story about how a family decides who gets to belong, and how conditionally that belonging was offered from the very beginning. Loki was never fully Aesir, and every god in that hall knew it, even while they laughed at his jokes, drank at his side, let him solve the disasters he half caused himself. He was useful. Usefulness is not the same as belonging, and somewhere underneath every clever rescue, Loki seems to have understood that difference better than any of them. That feast at Aegir's Hall was the last time Loki tried reminding this family what the blood oath was supposed to mean. Odin never answered him there. He does not answer him now, chained beneath the mountain either. The chain around Loki's wrists was never made only of his son's remains. It was made of every year he spent proving he belonged to people who had already decided he did not fully, not unconditionally, not the way Baldr did simply by being born into it. Loki remains there, bound until the day the old stories say the whole world ends, Ragnarok, when the chains finally give, and the same god this family cast out returns to lead an army against the hall that never let him fully in. Until then, there is only Sigyn. Every time that bowl fills, she has to turn away to empty it, and in those few seconds, the venom reaches Loki's face directly. The mountain shakes. That, the old story says, is what an earthquake actually is. She never lets it happen twice in a row. Families rarely break over one betrayal. They break in the years before it, in every small decision about who gets a seat at the table without having to earn it twice, and who has to keep proving it, feast after feast, rescue after rescue, until the one time he stops being useful is the only time anyone remembers. The gods called it a punishment for murder. Loki might have called it the moment the oath finally told the truth about what it was always worth, and the moment a family learned that the ones they only love for what they provide will, eventually, stop providing it.